can hear you. So I'm now just going to share the screen, and you should be, once I've done that, able to control the presentation. So just 2 seconds. So you should be able to now control it. Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, well, hello everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I've really enjoyed the presentation so far, and as with everyone else, sorry that I can't actually meet you in person, but hopefully next year, the next conference. So as you've heard, I'm the director of the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, and you've heard the name of that organisation a few times already this morning. So let me just say a few words about who we are and what we do. We're a relatively new organisation, so if you haven't heard of us, we're only 2 years old. And we are fully funded, and we've been established by the Nuffield Foundation, which is a grant-giving organisation. A grant-giving organisation that has funded a lot of research in family justice over the years. But the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory is a slightly different beast to the foundation, in that it is set up with the explicit purpose of making sure that good data and research and information about what's happening in family justice reaches those who are taking decisions about children and families. So we're a sort of bridge between the researchers and people like yourselves, and a wide range of other professionals and indeed families themselves, with a real mission to make the system more transparent to itself and to others. And as we've heard this morning, in private law, we, as in public law, so much of the work takes place in silos. There's so little opportunity to come together across the system and look at the journey that children and families go on, and to see what's happening not just in your own area but across the country. So our mission is to do that in a whole variety of ways. A big focus for us is this area of private law. I mean, across the board, family justice is very poorly served by data and research in comparison to other areas of public service. The amount of research that takes place, the level of data that's available, publicly available, is limited. But in private law, it's particularly the case. There's been an extraordinary lack of information about families who are using family courts to resolve their difficulties. And we're on a bit of a mission to try to help address that problem. So today I'm going to be talking about some research we published just a couple of months ago, which focuses on data, national data. But as you've heard from Justice Cobb earlier today, we're also involved in commissioning research of a different nature, where we are starting using sort of ethnographic techniques which involve spending a lot of time with families and getting to understand them and their experiences and perspectives, to be able to fill in some of the gaps that data can't help us with. So the data is helpful for a kind of overall national picture, but we also need different kinds of research to help inform the discussions. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about the use of admin data in a particular study that was conducted by our colleagues at Lancaster University, led by Dr. Linda Cusworth, and colleagues at Lancaster University, along with partners at Swansea University, where they're working with a very exciting outfit called the Sale Data Bank, which does some very amazing work with anonymised data and be able to link data to paint a picture about what's going on. So hopefully I'll be able to, my slide change doesn't seem to be working. What if we can go on to the next slide? I don't know whether Mike, you could do that. Brilliant, thank you. So admin data is data that's collected routinely by agencies. It's could be collected by the family courts. In our case, we are currently very heavily reliant on CAFCAS data, It could be data that's collected by any system, health system, education system, and so on. And there's a real advantage to looking at this data because in an anonymised form, we're not looking at individual records, but in an anonymised form, you can start seeing things at a population level. You can start seeing a whole picture, and you can trace patterns across time and across regions. And you can start using this data in a linked way to understand the journey that children and families go on. So this research focused on admin data. And if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So yes, you can see, you can read in full this report on our website. But it was the first attempt, and it's really extraordinary to say this is the first study that at a national level and a population level has sought to describe the families who are coming into the family court under private law proceedings. And we had to set some really at the foothills of understanding the knowledge here. So we had to start with some very simple questions. How many families are coming to court? Who are they? What kind of makeup of the families? What are they applying for, and who's applying, and how many of them are returners? And we, there's been small scale studies in local areas. There's been some attempts at piecing together some data in the past, but this was the first attempt to do so at a national level. So the next slide. So in headline terms, the first question is, how many families, and you'll be well aware that there's been a rise in the number of private law applications. In total, in the period of time that we looked at in this study, we were looking back to 2007 and all the way up to 2020, a total of, well, over 500,000 private law applications in England during that period. And we really centred in on standard parental applications, as we called them. So applications involving one or other parent of a child. Of course, some applications come in from other family members. But in this report, we're centering on what we called standard parental applications. And we looked at whether any of those applications were repeat applications within a 3-year period. So we defined repeat as coming back to or applying to come back to court within a 3-year period. And we, as I said, we use this facility at Swansea University called the SAIL Data Bank. And this holds all CAFCAS data for England and Wales. It provides us with access to Office of National Statistics data, so we can start to look at some of the family data that's held there. And it provides us to information about deprivation. And we're able to use the facility at Swansea to link the data to again, to sort of paint a picture about what's going on. So the next slide. So this jump, as I referenced earlier, in applications will be very familiar to you all. We're now at a stage where over 46,000 applications, private law applications, came to court in England in 2019-2020. So this is all pre-pandemic, and that affected over 65,000 children. And if you go to the next slide, you can see in a much more digestible way in a graph what's happened over the period of time. So there's been a steady rise throughout that period, with the exception of the period around the introduction of the legal aid changes, which saw a very sharp drop in applications initially, but since then applications have continued to rise and are now at a higher level than they were way back at the beginning of this period. And if you look, we're focusing here on England. We've seen the rate of applications coming into court in Wales slightly higher than in England, but an identical pattern of growth over that period of time. So yeah, that will be familiar to you in your work. Next slide, please. One of the key questions, and the one that really sort of frames all the discussions about private law is around, how many families are coming to court, what proportion of families turn to the court to resolve their difficulties. And it's a very hard question to answer. It sounds very simple, but it's rather difficult to answer because we don't know quite what we're comparing to. So are we asking ourselves how many families apply to court to resolve their difficulties of all those families who are separating? Do we include families that have already separated? Do we look at the population as a whole? When you look at existing research, the estimates of the number or the proportion of separating families who come to court ranges from 1 in 10 to 1 in 3. And yet we don't have very strong evidence to be able to tell us whether it's nearer to 1 in 10 or nearer to 1 in 3. In this study, we decided to have a look at the rate of application according to the population or all population of children or families with dependent children. So we looked at how many families with dependent children end up in court to resolve their difficulties. And when you look at that, it's a very small percentage. 0.75% of families with dependent children in England end up going to court. So actually, in a grand total of looking at all families with children, it's a very small proportion. What we don't know is accurately currently is of those who are separating or for whom the relationship has broken down, what proportion of those are ending up in court. It's probably closer to 1 in 10 than it is 1 in 3, but we don't have concrete evidence. And we have to be careful to when we're saying that so many families are resorting to court, that actually the majority of families are not resorting to court to resolve their difficulties, and we have to remember that. Next slide, please. So our analysis looked at who was making these applications and found, in line with previous research, that the majority of cases are indeed between 2 parents, usually brought by the non-resident parent, which is most often the father, and an application normally concerns a single child, normally or predominantly aged between 1 and 9 years old. Those who are applying to court tend to be in their late 20s and 30s predominantly. So that gives you a sense of the sort of general picture of who is making those applications. Again, this will be familiar to you. Next slide, please. So we were able to, for the first time, to have a look at the link with deprivation. And here we're looking at where people are living. So are they living in a deprived area rather than their income level? The relationship between where you live and your chances of coming into public law proceedings has been long established. The link between deprivation and public law proceedings has been long established, but no one's looked at private law proceedings in this way before. And we found a strong link between deprivation and the chances of making an application to court for those in private law. So as you can see from this graph here, the bottom 2 bars, the sort of nice bright yellow one and the grey one above, relate to the bottom 2 quintiles of the population. So that is the 40% most deprived area of the country. And we found that in relation to fathers, 52% of fathers who apply to court live in those areas. In relation to mothers, it was 54%. So there were disproportionately more families in deprived areas applying to court and in private law proceedings. And this really does provide us with some food for thought. It clearly underlines the need to think about access to alternatives to court and who's paying for those, what people can afford. It tells us something about the pressures those families are under and their current and previous circumstances. And it also starts to provide some context for the very striking regional differences that we see in private law proceedings. And if you go to the next slide, I think I can show you those. So yes, these graphs you may not be able to see in detail. They're very small on my screen, but you can get the sort of general drift. There are quite wide-ranging rates in applications to private law proceedings around the country. And there's essentially a bit of a north-south divide. So applications are consistently higher in the northeast, in the northwest, and in Yorkshire and Humber. They're lowest in London and the southeast. And for your region, they're sort of somewhere in between. And I think this is, worth exploring further in more detail, in further research, and certainly in further collaborative work that we'll be doing across the country to understand what's going on here. But certainly deprivation is one of the factors that we need to take into account, as well as potentially the culture of the court and the sort of the norms that sort of develop in different parts of the country in terms of the likelihood of turning to court. But a striking regional difference here, which mirrors in large part the regional difference we see in public law proceedings as well. Next slide, please. We took a look at what had happened around the introduction of legal aid changes and found that from 2013-14, the proportion of applications fell from parents who were living in the most deprived areas, who had a young child under the age of 5 and who were younger parents. And we think this is consistent with the emergence of what you might call a justice gap following the removal of legal aid. It does seem to have had an effect on the type of application or the type of family who are making an application to court since they were introduced. Next slide, please. So here we have a look at who is applying for an order and what order they're applying for. You can see a big difference between fathers and mothers here, with fathers, as I said earlier, more likely to be an applicant in the first place, and a shift in whether this is for a child arrangements order, which is the sort of the bottom 3 bars there, or whether it's for another kind of order, a specific issues order, a prohibited steps order, or so on, an enforcement order. So there's a difference in terms of who is applying and for what, and fathers are more likely to be an applicant in the first place. Mothers more likely to be respondents, but where mothers are applicants, they're more likely to make an order or to apply for an order that is not a child arrangements order, is a special order, an enforcement, a specific order, or a prohibited steps order. Next slide, please. You'll be familiar with the evidence around the high proportion of returners to court. It's between 24 and 27% of all applications return to court within 3 years, which very much confirmed by this data. Fathers are more likely to be repeat applicants. Mothers are more likely to be a respondent first and then an applicant later. So again, that sort of pattern flows from my previous observations about who's likely to apply in the first place. Next slide, please. So just sort of taking stock of all of this, I mean, firstly, just to underline the fact that we are really at the footholds of knowledge of who these families are, what their circumstances are, how they come to get to the point where they are making an application to court. And as we heard from Justice Cobb, so much of previous discussions about the need to change the system has started with the system and the demands on the system. But there's a real appetite to shift the conversation to understand the needs of families and their children, and to make sure that what comes out of discussions about reforms to the private law system reflects and builds on the understanding of the needs of families, which is why we're investing so much in research here and other forms of research. But there's some initial lessons that we can draw from this data. I mean, certainly the evidence on deprivation is worth noting, worth thinking about, understanding in terms of the context in which families are living, their likelihood of being able to access services by their own means, and the likely pressures that they are under when they are in the process of applying to court. There are the regional differences exposed here for the first time are important and interesting. Deprivation is likely to play a part, but possibly not the only part of understanding what might be going on, and getting underneath the reasons for such vast differences in application rates across the country is something that we would like to explore further. We want to continue to try and understand this issue of what proportion of families do end up going to court. There's such a strong narrative that the courts are unable to cope with the level of demand, as we've heard, and it's clear that that's true. But part of the solution to that problem might be to increase the capacity of the courts, as it is also to divert families to alternative ways of resolving their disputes. So I think it's really important that we don't misquote research or misunderstand the fact that the existing evidence is that a small proportion of all families with children end up in court. Perhaps as many as 30% of separating families seek to resolve their difficulties in court, but it could be much less than that. You've seen the data on the more complex applications that seem to be coming through. So we were surprised at the falling proportion of orders that are child arrangement orders. So if you look back a decade ago, 2/3 of all orders made in private law were in relation to standard parental applications were child arrangement orders. Last year that had fallen to 52%. This rise in the number of more complex applications is interesting and hadn't been noted before, and I think does raise questions about the types of needs that need to be addressed and how the system needs to respond both within the court and outside of the court. And I've spoken here really about standard parental applications, but we do also need to understand what is happening outside of those standard parent applications, the number of non-parent applications coming into private law proceedings, and where there's likely to be an overlap with family members who are also taking on caring roles for whom public law proceedings may be appropriate. So in sum, we begin to understand what's going on. There's a huge number of questions still to answer. I hope that provides you with some helpful context for your own thinking, and very keen to continue the dialogue on where we might look next to help to better understand the families that are using the family court. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff, and I know my team really get fed up with the fact that I'm always looking at data because it unlocks so many nuances and information and gives you the answers to many of the challenges that we face. I found it very interesting looking at that difference between what men look for when they apply to court and what women look for, and actually started using that in how we communicate to people. And I think there's lots of lessons there about how we communicate with those in lower income groups as well, because I think we can do better at trying to help support that group specifically. We have had a question come in, or an observation really come in, with the drop in 2013-14 caseload. That also coincided with the introduction of the sort of the work on the MIAMs. We just wondered, has any research been done that you've picked up on actually the impact of mediation, or the number of cases, or how mediation fits into this whole arena?
Yes, thank you. I should have mentioned that when I looked at that slide. There is, well, firstly to say the data on mediation is really poor. I mean, we only have some data about public funded mediation, so we don't have any national data on privately funded mediation. The MOJ publishes data around publicly funded mediation, and we saw a dramatic drop in mediation around the time of the LASPO changes being introduced. The drop was about a third and hasn't recovered since that point. So unlike the applications to court, which did have a sort of immediate shock, as you saw in my graph, and then recovered, in mediation we've not seen that recovery, and it's something that we are highlighting in our work, both the existing knowledge we have around mediation, but also the gap in data here, which is a crucial gap, I think, in terms of being able to paint a full picture of families' experiences. We have an infographic on our website which highlights the areas which we have data and where we don't have data, which we regularly update, and mediation is one of the things that we spotlight in that infographic to really highlight the fact that we need to address the data gap.
I think that's one of the things we need to take away and think about, how we can help try and fill some of those gaps, and especially set up the right systems going forward to enable the legal system to understand what the impact of mediation is. Because one concern I have is, with the courts trying to move cases out of court and into mediation, is whether there's capacity in the mediation world. With lack of data, it's very hard to know whether we have that capacity. I know that there has been quite a drop in legal aid providers, for example. So there's a lot we need to do to help that process continue. I'm gonna finish there and move on, because we'll come back and there's lots of questions that all sort of integrate between these different sort of topics when we get to the discussion panel. So thank you, Lisa. That was really helpful.